everyone. Before we dive into today's story, I want you to pause for a moment and ask yourself a simple question. When politicians say they are defending democracy, what do they actually mean? Do they mean protecting the rules that restrain power, or protecting outcomes they believe are morally correct? Because the difference between those two ideas is where democracies quietly fracture. The hearing that unfolded between Mike Johnson and Jamie Raskin was not loud. There were no viral shouting matches, no desk pounding, no theatrical interruptions designed for cable news clips. And that is exactly why it mattered. What happened in that room was far more unsettling than political theater. It was a slow, methodical collision between two philosophies of power, one rooted in restraint, the other in moral urgency. And both men believed, genuinely, that they were on the right side of history. Mike Johnson entered the hearing room without spectacle. No stack of aides whispering into his ear, no performative indignation. Just a man who speaks like someone accustomed to reading statutes instead of sound bites. That calm demeanor was not accidental. Johnson understands something many modern politicians do not. The quieter the room, the more dangerous the questions become. Across from him sat Jamie Raskin, a man whose public identity is built on intellectual authority. A constitutional law professor, a seasoned litigator of ideas, someone who has spent decades teaching students how power is supposed to function, and someone who believes deeply that democracy is fragile enough to justify extraordinary measures. That contrast alone framed the entire exchange. Johnson treats the Constitution as a limit that must be honored regardless of fear. Raskin treats it as a framework that must be defended, even if that defense stretches its edges. Neither approach is cartoonish, neither is stupid, but only one survives long-term without eroding trust. The opening minutes of the hearing felt deceptively routine. Formal language, procedural acknowledgments, the ritual choreography of congressional oversight. But underneath, it was tension so thick it didn't need volume to be felt. This was not about January 6th alone. It was about precedent. About whether congressional investigations exist to discover truth or to enforce narratives. Johnson did not begin with accusations. He began with structure. He asked Raskin to clarify definitions, authority, due process, equal application of standards, the kinds of questions professors usually enjoy answering. Except this time, the answers mattered, because Johnson was not asking hypotheticals. He was asking whether the rules Raskin taught were the same rules he practiced. That is where the discomfort began. Raskin spoke eloquently, as expected. His vocabulary was precise, his framing moral. He spoke of threats to democratic norms, of unprecedented danger, of the need for accountability, and much of it sounded reasonable, even persuasive. Until Johnson did something subtle but devastating. He stopped responding to rhetoric and started measuring actions. Not intentions, not motivations, actions. This is where my own analytical position begins to take shape. In American politics, we have become dangerously comfortable with judging behavior by intent instead of impact. If the intent feels righteous, the process becomes negotiable. That is not how stable systems endure. That is how they rot from the inside, while everyone congratulates themselves for caring. Johnson's questions were not aggressive. They were forensic. He asked why certain witnesses were called and others were not, why some evidence was highlighted while other material was quietly excluded, why the right to confrontation, a cornerstone of constitutional fairness, appeared optional. Each question narrowed the space Raskin had to maneuver. And that is the key difference between persuasion and performance. Performance expands space. Persuasion constrains it. Raskin pushed back by appealing to context, to urgency, to moral necessity. And again, those arguments resonate emotionally, but they fail structurally. Because once urgency becomes the justification, restraint becomes the enemy. Johnson never accused Raskin of bad faith. He didn't need to. Instead, he kept returning to a single quiet implication. If these methods were used against people you agree with, would you still defend them? That question hovered over the hearing like an unspoken verdict. This is where the audience at home became part of the story. Not as spectators, as jurors, because everyone watching had to confront their own bias. Would you tolerate these tactics if the political roles were reversed? Or do principles only matter when your side is losing? Raskin's position is not irrational. He genuinely believes democracy is under threat. History gives him reasons to fear complacency, but fear is not a governing philosophy, it is a reaction. And reactions do not age well once institutionalized. Johnson understands this. That is why he speaks the language of limits, not because limits are comforting, but because they are durable. A system that depends on virtuous people staying virtuous is not a system. It is a gamble. The early portion of the hearing made one thing clear. This was not a clash between good and evil. It was a clash between two visions of authority, one that trusts intention, and one that trusts structure. And history has been remarkably consistent about which one survives abuse. As the questions deepened, the room grew quieter. Not because people were bored, but because silence is what happens when rhetoric runs out of room. That silence is where accountability lives. And that silence is where this story truly begins. The tension did not rise suddenly. It tightened gradually, almost politely. The way pressure builds in a sealed room when no one opens a window. By the time the hearing moved past definitions and into consequences, everyone understood that this was no longer abstract. This was about power in practice, and about who gets to decide when rules can bend. Jamie Raskin leaned into what he knows best: history. He referenced past democratic crises, moments when institutions failed because they moved too slowly, hesitated too long, trusted norms that bad actors were eager to exploit. His argument was clear. Extraordinary threats require extraordinary responses, and to many viewers, that logic feels intuitive. If a system is under attack, shouldn't its defenders act decisively? Shouldn't they use every available tool to prevent collapse? That framing is powerful because it appeals to fear and responsibility at the same time. Johnson did not dismiss that fear, and that restraint mattered. Instead of minimizing the threat, he acknowledged it directly. Yes, democratic systems can fail. Yes, bad actors exist. Yes, vigilance is necessary. Then he drew a line that Raskin would not cross. Vigilance is not permission. Protection is not exemption. Johnson returned again to process, to how authority is exercised, not why. He pressed on standards, on whether those standards were applied consistently, on whether investigative tools were being used to illuminate facts or to construct conclusions. This is where the philosophical divide sharpened. Raskin sees democracy as a living organism that must be actively defended, even aggressively. Johnson sees democracy as a contract that collapses the moment enforcement becomes selective. Both men are sincere, but sincerity does not resolve contradiction. At one point, Raskin leaned back and smiled slightly, the expression of a professor confident in the moral arc of his argument. He spoke about accountability as a moral obligation, about ensuring that powerful people do not escape consequences simply because institutions move cautiously. The subtext was unmistakable. Delay is complicity. Johnson responded with something far less dramatic, but far more dangerous to that argument. He asked who defines accountability, and by what limits. He pointed out that systems built on moral certainty inevitably justify excess, not because people intend harm, but because certainty erodes self-doubt. This is where the exchange took on a darker seriousness, not angry, not explosive, just heavy, because everyone watching understands this tension intuitively, even if they've never articulated it. If you believe your cause is righteous enough, how far are you willing to go? And who stops you when you cross the line? Raskin argued that congressional investigations are political by nature. That neutrality is a myth. That pretending otherwise is dishonest. And in a narrow sense, he is correct. Politics always influences oversight. But Johnson pushed the argument one step further. If neutrality is impossible, then restraint becomes even more essential. Otherwise, oversight turns into retaliation. The room felt smaller as this logic settled in, not because Johnson was dominating rhetorically, but because his argument removed escape routes. You could disagree with him, but you could not dismiss the risk he was outlining. This is where I found myself leaning toward Johnson's framework, not emotionally, but structurally. A democracy cannot survive on trust alone, especially not trust in people who believe themselves morally exceptional. Systems survive because they assume bad faith as a possibility. That is why constraints exist. Raskin's responses grew more passionate. He invoked the stakes repeatedly. The danger of normalization, the risk of letting threats fade into bureaucratic obscurity. There was urgency in his voice, and that urgency is not fake. But urgency is also intoxicating. It convinces people that rules are obstacles rather than safeguards. Johnson waited for that momentum to peak. Then he did something subtle and almost unsettling. He asked whether Raskin would be comfortable with the same investigative methods being used by future majorities he deeply disagrees with. Not hypothetically, practically. Would he defend the precedent if the ideological roles were reversed? That question lingered longer than any accusation could have, because it stripped the argument of its moral armor. If the answer is no, then the precedent is flawed. If the answer is yes, then power becomes dangerously unconstrained. Raskin did not give a direct answer. He spoke instead about the uniqueness of the moment, about how some situations are incomparable, about how history would judge intent. That is where his position weakened, because history rarely judges intent kindly. It judges outcomes and structures and precedents that outlive the people who created them. The hearing room had shifted completely by this point. No one was waiting for a viral moment anymore. This was not about clips. It was about credibility. And credibility is earned slowly and lost quietly. Johnson's calm became a kind of pressure, not intimidating, inescapable. He was not arguing that investigations should not happen. He was arguing that they must be survivable, that a system which only works when the right people are in charge is already broken. That idea unsettled more than one member in the room, because it forces an uncomfortable self-assessment. Are we building guardrails, or are we building tools we hope never get used against us? Raskin's philosophy assumes moral clarity. Johnson's assumes moral fallibility. And political history overwhelmingly supports the latter assumption. As the exchange continued, something else became clear. This was not just about January 6th. It was about the future of congressional power, about whether investigations are meant to uncover facts or enforce narratives, about whether the Constitution is a shield against abuse or an obstacle to efficiency. Johnson framed restraint not as weakness, but as discipline, as the difference between authority and dominance. That framing matters, because in modern political media, restraint rarely wins attention, but it often preserves legitimacy. Raskin's final remarks in this section leaned heavily on moral responsibility, on the idea that failing to act decisively is itself an injustice. And that resonates, especially in an age of outrage. But it also reveals the danger. When inaction becomes immoral, action becomes compulsory. And when action is compulsory, limits become optional. That is not democracy. That is momentum. The room felt quieter again as this realization took hold. Not silence of boredom, silence of recognition, because everyone understood that this debate would not end in that room. It would echo forward, shaping how future majorities justify their behavior. And that is where the real risk lies. The second phase of this hearing did not resolve the conflict. It clarified it. Two visions of democracy, incompatible at their extremes, colliding without theatrics. One trusts urgency, the other trusts structure. And as the session moved forward, it became increasingly clear that only one of those visions can endure without eventually devouring itself. That realization set the stage for what came next. By the time the exchange moved into its next phase, the hearing no longer felt like an argument. It felt like a stress test, not of personalities, but of assumptions. And assumptions are always more fragile than people realize, especially when they are exposed under calm light instead of rhetorical heat. Jamie Raskin shifted his posture as the discussion narrowed. This was familiar terrain for him. He has spent years operating in rooms where moral urgency is currency, where the language of crisis compresses debate, and where hesitation is framed as complicity. He spoke now with the confidence of someone accustomed to having the last word. He reminded the room that democracies do not collapse overnight. They decay when institutions fail to confront threats early enough, when rules are used as cover for inaction, when those entrusted with oversight choose caution over courage. It was a compelling narrative. It always is. Because it casts restraint as weakness and decisiveness as virtue. Mike Johnson did not interrupt. He waited. That pause mattered. Because when urgency is allowed to run uninterrupted, it reveals its own excesses. Johnson responded by reframing the entire question. He suggested that the most dangerous moment for a democracy is not when it faces threats. It is when it convinces itself that the threat is so obvious that process no longer matters. That is not a popular argument, but it is a historically grounded one. Raskin countered by pointing to moments when institutions failed precisely because they clung too tightly to procedure. He cited examples where legal formalism allowed authoritarian movements to advance unchecked. The implication was clear. Rules can be exploited. Process can be weaponized by bad actors. Johnson acknowledged that risk without conceding the conclusion. Yes, process can be abused. So can power. The difference is that abuse of process is visible and contestable. Abuse of power justified by necessity rarely is. That distinction hung in the air, because it cuts against modern political instincts. We live in an era that prizes outcomes over legitimacy. Johnson was asking whether legitimacy can survive that trade. Raskin leaned forward, his voice tightening slightly. He argued that democratic survival is not a neutral endeavor, that there are moments when choosing sides is unavoidable, and that pretending otherwise is itself a political choice. This is where the exchange took on an almost philosophical weight. Because Raskin is not wrong that neutrality can conceal cowardice. But Johnson is not wrong that partisanship dressed as principle corrodes trust. The hearing had reached a point where neither man could fully refute the other. Instead, they were exposing the costs of each approach. Johnson pressed on precedent. What happens when the tools normalized today are inherited by people with very different values tomorrow? Raskin responded that some moments demand risk, that refusing to act decisively can be more dangerous than acting imperfectly. It was an argument rooted in fear of regret, fear that history will condemn hesitation. Johnson answered with a quieter fear, fear that history will condemn certainty. This is where my own analytical lens sharpened. Political systems do not fail because people stop caring. They fail because people care so much that they stop doubting themselves. Raskin's position assumes that moral clarity will restrain excess. Johnson's assumes that moral clarity is precisely when excess becomes tempting. Those are not abstract concerns. They are observable patterns, again and again in political history. As the discussion continued, Johnson introduced a subtle but critical shift. He asked not whether extraordinary measures were justified, but who decides when they stop. That question unsettled the room more than any accusation could have. Because power expanded in crisis rarely contracts on schedule. Raskin spoke about institutional checks, about congressional oversight, about accountability through elections. Johnson responded that those mechanisms weaken when trust erodes, when half the country believes investigations are selective, when outcomes appear predetermined, when process feels performative. At that point, oversight stops looking like accountability. It starts looking like enforcement. That distinction matters deeply, because enforcement without legitimacy breeds resistance, and resistance hardens divisions. The hearing's tone shifted again here, not toward hostility, toward gravity, because this was no longer about one committee or one event. It was about whether Americans can still agree on rules even when they disagree on outcomes. Raskin framed the conflict as a choice between action and paralysis. Johnson reframed it as a choice between law and momentum. Neither framing is comfortable. Both carry risk. But only one has a built-in stopping mechanism. As a political analyst, this is where I part ways with Raskin's approach. Not because his fears are unfounded, but because his solution assumes permanence of virtue. History offers no such guarantee. Johnson's insistence on restraint is not moral indifference. It is moral humility. An acknowledgement that no group, no matter how convinced of its righteousness, should be trusted without limits. The hearing room reflected this tension physically now. People sat still. Phones lay untouched. No one was searching for clips. They were watching an argument that could not be simplified. That complexity is rare in modern political discourse. Raskin attempted to reassert narrative control by returning to values. Democracy, equality, the danger of normalization. Johnson answered by returning to structure. Standards, consistency, the danger of exception. At one point, a faint smile crossed Johnson's face as he noted how often the word unprecedented had been used. He observed, lightly, that every generation believes its crisis is uniquely existential. It was a rare moment of dry humor, the kind that doesn't land as a joke so much as a reminder. That perspective matters, because when everything is unprecedented, nothing is governed. Raskin did not laugh. He shouldn't have. The point was not humor, it was warning. Johnson's argument was not that threats are imaginary. It was that inflation of threat language eventually exhausts credibility. When everything is framed as an emergency, people stop listening. And when people stop listening, institutions lose authority. The third phase of the hearing crystallized the dilemma. Do we prioritize speed or legitimacy, urgency or endurance? Raskin leaned toward speed, Johnson toward endurance, and neither could fully disprove the other. But one path carries a built-in brake. The other depends entirely on restraint from those holding power. That is not a system. It is a hope. As the exchange slowed, it became clear that the real debate was not between two men. It was between two visions of democratic survival. One believes democracy must be defended aggressively, even at procedural cost. The other believes democracy collapses the moment defense replaces law, and that unresolved tension set the stage for what would come next. Because once power and fear intersect, something always gives. At this point in the hearing, the exchange stopped feeling theoretical and started feeling diagnostic in a different way. Not a test of ideas alone, but a test of temperament. How each man behaved when the argument no longer offered easy moral leverage revealed more than any prepared statement could. And this is where my own assessment, as someone who studies American political power rather than merely reacting to it, becomes unavoidable. Because what separates sustainable democracy from performative democracy is not passion, but discipline. Jamie Raskin's posture in this phase reflected a familiar instinct in modern progressive politics. The belief that history is leaning in one direction, and that resistance to that direction is not merely disagreement, but obstruction. That belief produces urgency. Urgency produces moral compression. And moral compression produces shortcuts. Raskin did not advocate lawlessness. That distinction matters. He advocated what he would describe as proportional response. The idea that extraordinary circumstances temporarily justify an expanded authority. But temporary expansions have a documented tendency to become permanent fixtures. That is not ideology. It is institutional physics. Mike Johnson, by contrast, behaved like someone deeply suspicious of his own side's future impulses. That may sound counterintuitive in a polarized environment, but it is precisely what constitutional systems are built upon. They assume that today's guardians may become tomorrow's abusers, and they design friction accordingly. This is where Johnson's restraint becomes not just admirable, but strategically intelligent. He did not frame himself as the moral counterweight to Raskin. He framed himself as the procedural counterweight, and that is far more difficult to dismiss, because procedure does not care who you are. It only cares what you do. Raskin attempted to reclaim momentum by emphasizing consequences. He spoke of the cost of inaction, of what happens when institutions fail to respond decisively, of the danger of letting threats normalize themselves through delay. Those arguments resonate emotionally, but emotion is not self-regulating. Johnson answered not by denying those risks, but by asking who bears responsibility when power is misused in response. Who answers when precedent becomes policy? Who repairs legitimacy once it has been traded for efficiency? Those are not rhetorical questions. They are structural ones. And Raskin's framework offers no satisfying answer beyond trust. Trust in judgment. Trust in intent. Trust in alignment of values. That is not governance. That is faith. One of the most revealing moments came when Johnson asked whether democratic survival could justify unequal application of standards. The question was not accusatory. It was almost academic. If two groups engage in politically disruptive behavior, but only one is investigated with full force, what message does that send? Raskin's response focused on context, on intent, on perceived threat level. Johnson responded by noting that perception is not a stable legal category. It is subjective, and subjectivity, once embedded in enforcement, becomes bias. This exchange exposed a deeper truth. Progressive legal thinking often prioritizes outcomes over symmetry. Conservative constitutional thinking prioritizes symmetry over outcomes. Neither approach is morally pure, but only one maintains legitimacy across ideological shifts. As a political analyst, this is where I align more closely with Johnson's reasoning. Not because his side is inherently more trustworthy, but because his framework assumes mistrust. And systems built on mistrust are paradoxically more resilient. Raskin's model assumes that those wielding power will exercise restraint voluntarily. Johnson's assumes they will not. History overwhelmingly favors Johnson's assumption. There was also something revealing in how each man related to time. Raskin spoke in compressed timelines. Now, urgent, before it is too late. Johnson spoke in extended horizons. Decades, precedents. What happens when today's emergency logic becomes tomorrow's routine? That difference is not accidental. It reflects how each man views power. For Raskin, power is a tool that must be used decisively when history demands it. For Johnson, power is a liability that must be constrained even when it feels necessary. Neither perspective is cowardly, but one is far more compatible with pluralism. Pluralism requires rules that protect people you disagree with, even people you fear. That is uncomfortable, but it is essential. As the fourth phase of the hearing unfolded, the room sensed that the debate had moved beyond January 6th, beyond committees, beyond specific investigations. It had become a referendum on how Americans want power exercised when emotions run high. Raskin's arguments appealed to conscience. Johnson's appealed to caution. The uncomfortable truth is that conscience without limits becomes coercive, and caution without conscience becomes paralysis. But the Constitution was not written to maximize speed. It was written to minimize regret. Johnson's demeanor reflected that philosophy throughout. No triumph, no sarcasm, just repetition, consistency, a quiet insistence that rules only matter if they survive stress. Raskin's frustration was visible by this point, not anger, something closer to disbelief, the disbelief of someone who cannot understand why others do not see the urgency as clearly as he does. That mindset is dangerous not because it is wrong, but because it is convinced it cannot be wrong. As an observer, this is where sympathy and skepticism coexist. Raskin's fear is understandable, but fear is a poor architect. Johnson's caution may feel insufficient in moments of crisis, but caution is what prevents crisis logic from becoming permanent governance. The fourth phase clarified what was truly at stake. Not which man was more sincere, but which philosophy leaves room for disagreement without domination. And only one of them does. As the exchange slowed, the air in the room felt heavier, not lighter, because no resolution was possible, only recognition. Recognition that democracy does not fail because people stop believing in it. It fails when belief becomes certainty, and certainty demands obedience rather than consent. That realization set the tone for the final phase of the hearing, not with fireworks, but with consequence. As the hearing approached its final moments, the room did not feel relieved. It felt sobered. This was not the kind of conclusion that delivers catharsis or closure. It was the kind that leaves an audience sitting with discomfort, replaying what they had just witnessed, and wondering what it meant beyond the room. And that, more than any dramatic exchange, is what made this hearing consequential. Jamie Raskin closed by returning once more to the moral frame that has defined his public career. He spoke about responsibility, about the obligation of those in power to act when they believe democratic norms are under threat, about how history does not forgive hesitation when institutions fail to defend themselves. There was no mockery in his tone, only conviction, and conviction deserves to be taken seriously, because democracies do not survive on cynicism alone. They require people who care enough to act. But care, unrestrained, can become coercion. That is the paradox Raskin never fully resolved. Mike Johnson's final remarks were notably restrained. He did not frame himself as the victor. He did not accuse. He summarized. And that choice mattered. He acknowledged the fear that drives Raskin's urgency. Then he separated fear from authority with deliberate clarity. He reminded the room that the Constitution was not designed for ideal conditions. It was designed for moments when people are afraid, angry, and convinced they are right. That is when rules matter most. Johnson emphasized that democratic legitimacy does not come from outcomes alone. It comes from consistency, from applying standards even when it is inconvenient, especially when it is inconvenient. He warned, without theatrics, that once institutions teach the public that rules are flexible based on who holds power, trust collapses. And without trust, enforcement replaces consent. That warning lingered long after he finished speaking. As an analyst, this is where the story resolves itself. Not in favor of one man as a hero or the other as a villain, but in favor of a framework that can survive its own misuse. Raskin's approach assumes a level of moral clarity that history rarely sustains. Johnson's approach assumes fallibility as the default. Systems built on fallibility endure longer than those built on faith. That does not make Johnson morally superior. It makes his position structurally safer. The uncomfortable truth is that democracy cannot be protected by people who believe they are uniquely qualified to suspend its rules. That logic has ended badly in every system that embraced it. Power justified by urgency rarely remains temporary. Exceptions become habits. Habits become norms. And norms become authority. Raskin's fear of democratic erosion is legitimate. But erosion accelerates when half the country believes investigations are selective, when accountability appears partisan, when procedures look engineered rather than impartial. Johnson's insistence on restraint is not indifference to danger. It is recognition of a deeper one, that democracies rot faster from internal distrust than from external threat. There was a subtle, almost ironic moment near the end of the hearing that few commentators noticed. As Raskin spoke passionately about protecting democracy, Johnson quietly straightened the papers in front of him. No rush, no reaction, just order. It was a small visual detail, but a revealing one. One man animated by urgency, the other anchored by structure. That contrast is not accidental. It reflects how each understands power. Raskin believes power must be used decisively to preserve moral order. Johnson believes power must be constrained to preserve legitimacy. Only one of those philosophies survives disagreement. The hearing ended without applause. No one stood. No one smiled. That silence was the most honest response the moment could receive, because what had been exposed was not a scandal. It was a fault line running through modern American politics, between those who believe democracy is preserved by action and those who believe it is preserved by limits, between urgency and endurance, between conscience and constraint. Neither side can claim easy victory, but only one offers a path that does not depend on perpetual moral consensus. As viewers, especially those consuming this moment on YouTube rather than in the room, the question is not who sounded more passionate. It is whose framework you would trust when power shifts hands, because it always does. Today's guardians become tomorrow's opposition, and today's exceptions become tomorrow's precedents. If there is a lesson worth carrying forward, it is this. Democracy does not usually die because people stop believing in it. It erodes when belief becomes certainty, when urgency becomes permission, when power stops doubting itself. Mike Johnson and Jamie Raskin both believe they are defending democracy. They simply disagree on what democracy needs most when it is under strain. One offers action fueled by conviction. The other offers restraint grounded in distrust of power itself. History has already tested both approaches, and it has been remarkably consistent about the outcome. Thank you for staying through this analysis. If you care about politics not as a team sport, but as a system you have to live under, this is not a debate you can afford to ignore. Stay critical. Stay curious. And remember that urgency is not the same thing as legitimacy. What made this moment resonate beyond the hearing room was not a single exchange, but the contrast in governing philosophy it revealed. Mike Johnson and Jamie Raskin were not merely arguing over procedure or interpretation. They were articulating two fundamentally different visions of how democratic power should behave when pressure mounts. Raskin's worldview is rooted in urgency. He approaches politics with the belief that institutions must respond forcefully when they perceive danger, even if that response stretches long-standing norms. To him, delay looks like complicity. Restraint feels like surrender. Johnson's worldview begins from the opposite assumption. He treats power itself as the primary risk factor. In his framing, the greatest threat to democracy is not hesitation, but precedent. Not what one side does in a moment of fear, but what that action enables the next time fear is invoked. This difference is subtle, but critical, because democracies rarely collapse in dramatic fashion. They erode through habits. Habits formed when extraordinary measures become routine, when moral certainty replaces procedural humility, when people stop asking not only, is this justified, but also, what does this normalize? Raskin's arguments appeal strongly to audiences who believe the current moment is unprecedented. If the threat is unique, then unique responses seem reasonable. That logic is emotionally compelling. But history shows that nearly every generation believes its crisis is singular. Johnson's approach implicitly rejects that assumption. He treats every crisis as dangerous precisely because it feels unique. That is why limits exist. Not because leaders lack conviction, but because conviction is unreliable when filtered through power. One of the most revealing aspects of the hearing was how each man spoke about consequences. Raskin focused on outcomes, preventing harm, stopping perceived threats before they metastasize. Johnson focused on process. Who decides? Under what authority? And with which safeguards? Neither perspective is inherently illegitimate, but only one scales when political control changes hands. That is the uncomfortable truth often missing from partisan commentary. Every tool created to stop one faction will eventually be held by another. Every exception written for today, summary, becomes tomorrow's justification. Johnson repeatedly returned to this idea not as a rhetorical flourish, but as a warning drawn from institutional memory. He was not asking whether a given action felt right in the moment. He was asking whether it could be abused later. That distinction matters more than most viewers realize. Raskin's defenders often frame criticism as indifference to democratic risk. That framing is incomplete. Concern for democratic stability does not require agreement on tactics. In fact, disagreement over tactics is a sign of institutional health. What weakens trust is the impression that standards shift depending on who benefits. The hearing subtly exposed how fragile that trust has become. When audiences no longer believe procedures are neutral, every action feels partisan, even when it is legally defensible. Johnson seemed acutely aware of this perception gap. His restraint was not passive, it was strategic, an attempt to reinforce predictability in a system that increasingly feels reactive. Raskin, by contrast, leaned into moral clarity. His language carried the urgency of someone who believes delay itself is dangerous. That urgency resonates deeply in polarized environments, but it also accelerates polarization, because urgency demands alignment, and alignment demands loyalty, and loyalty discourages dissent. Democracies struggle when dissent becomes synonymous with threat. One of the most important but least discussed implications of the exchange is how it models behavior for future leaders. Young politicians watching this moment are not just learning arguments. They are learning norms. They are observing which approaches are rewarded by media attention and public reaction. Raskin's style generates intensity. Johnson's style generates stability.